everyone. It's so great to be with you today. And once again, welcome to Equal Pay Day. Really excited to spend some time with you today. My name is Ginger Siegel, and I have the honor of leading our North America Small Business segment at MasterCard. And really excited to take some time today to really hear from you, to hear your questions, your thoughts, your concerns. If you can put your questions in the Q&A box, that would be great. And we're just going to flow through the time and really anything you want to ask on this topic, thoughts, questions, comments that you might have would absolutely be great. I know this has been a really tough time for those of you that are business owners, for those of you that are thinking about a business, and we want you to know that we are behind you. I think our partnership with Create and Cultivate means so much to us at MasterCard because they're an organization that really focuses on helping female entrepreneurs to be their best self and succeed. Particularly during COVID, this has been a very, very tough time. And we know that all of you are going to come out on the other side even stronger. So I'm going to take a look at some questions that we have. We actually have a question here already about, as a small business owner, how should I assess my pay policies and procedures? Well, I think this is really an important question. And I think that the assessment of pay policies and procedures, that part's pretty easy, right? There's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of government organizations that keep track of pay ranges. What I do think is important is to kind of take a step back and to think about the procedures that you've set up in running your business. So as an example, even something like a job description, making sure those job descriptions are clear, but also offer some flexibility in there as jobs might change. And then when you think about the assessment of your wages and what you're going to pay, it really should be done in the context of overall employee policy. So you want to think through things that are of major importance to employees. Monetary compensation is one, but it's not the only factor. And you want to ensure that you create an employee policy that takes into account issues like maintaining a balance between work and family, reducing job stress, and then looking at the type of health and retirement benefits you offer. So I think that that's a really key part of this. And then as you structure your performance reviews, making sure that each employee is aware of expectations, and those are equal expectations for equal jobs. So great question, and I hope that's helpful. I'm going to look at some other questions now. And again, for those of you just joining, I see some other folks joining. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to answer them. If you've got questions, if you've got discussion points, that would really be great. So I'm just waiting for a few more questions here. So here's a good question, which is, how should I communicate pay equity processes internally? And I think this is a really important question. I think that making sure that your organization has a very clear view on how you've established jobs, how you've established duties, how you've established overall functions is critically important. The time to really communicate these processes is when you have a new hire. And that is actually the most important time to do this, is making sure that new hires have a very specific view of what you're trying to do. And we find this is really important and helps people to know when they come in. And it also really prevents somewhat in terms of salary disparities, because new hires have a very clear view of your process. The other thing is to review employee compensation on a regular basis. And it's also important to separate kind of compensation reviews from performance reviews. So as an owner, making sure that you understand how your compensation is going to be built and placed to provide equal pay for equal work, but then really separating those out from a performance review perspective. Also making sure that you disclose salary ranges for different positions and levels. And of course, advocate for your people, encouraging people to be open and honest when these discussions take place. So again, for those of you on the call, please feel free to put your questions in Q&A. We have another question here, actually. It's no secret that women are exiting from the workforce when they have children. And what policies and procedures should I put in place to prevent this from happening? Well, I think this is a really great question. And we know that discriminatory hiring practices and promotion decisions that prevent women from gaining leadership roles and highly paid positions are actually sustaining the gender pay gap. And it's not only the pay gap, but it's also the opportunity gap. And so in addition to knowing that the government has to shape policies to address the fallout, it's really urgent that we put female workers on this equal footing. And it's really important to make sure that this is something that's ingrained in the company. Especially during COVID, we've seen this as a very big issue. We know that women make up the majority of workers on the front lines, and they're providing a lot of essential health and care services. So we also know that 305 million full-time jobs have been lost since the pandemic, and many of these have been through women. So I think it's critically important to think about these things as you're building out some of these policies to ensure that some of the things I talked about before, that there's a lot of focus on this, helping female employees who might be taking more of the burden in terms of the home life, creating a work-life balance to ensure that your female workers can have the access to help and can also have the flexibility. So those are just a couple ideas that I wanted to add there. So also, again, I want to remind people, we know there's people that are just joining, and please feel free to put some questions in the Q&A box. Another question that came through is, how can I actually measure compensation differences to see if there's a bias? I think what's really important here is that in order to ensure that there isn't a bias, this can't be a one and done particular situation. There has to be a constant focus on looking at your pay, looking at all of your employees, and making sure that these things are consistently held equal. And I think it's really in your planning process. So I think, as I said before, it really starts with job descriptions and really ensuring that the job descriptions have a tremendous amount of equality in it, and that the job descriptions are built not based on who has the job, but based on the job. And what I have found in my experience is by doing that, you really help to eliminate some of the potential issues that you have in gender gaps, because the job description wasn't really built based on that. So I think that's another really important point to bring up. So I'm looking for some more questions. Again, for those of you that are on, please feel free to drop some questions in the Q&A box. Here's a question that just came through. So what's your best advice for small business owners who are compensating employees in line to competitive market rates and their experience? While you'd like to do more, it's just not feasible at this particular time. You know, that's really a great question. I think that small business owners, especially in this environment, have a huge amount of emotional capital that they can spend. When people are working for small businesses today, there's much more than just the pay that they receive. And I think that all of you out there who are small business owners have a tremendous opportunity to utilize all the other great pieces that happen because you're a small business owner. And this particularly is seen, especially during COVID, where there's an important community component to this. So I think that by separating out some of the other benefits of working for, let's say, a smaller business versus a larger company, and the things that you can add, that person having more opportunity to invest in terms of their time, their knowledge. There's a lot less resources amongst small businesses, right? And there's much more that each individual employee can chip in, a lot more opportunities to share ideas. So hopefully that's helpful. I think those are some of the key things that I've seen. Another question, when doing an analysis, how should I think about executives and are they treated differently? I think this is a great question. And I think it goes back to what I said before, is that it's not about the executive level versus not, it's the job description. Normally, you would expect that an executive level position is going to have a greater level of responsibility. And I always find that that's a really much better way to put it, which is what are the responsibilities of the job, and the responsibilities of the job drive the job description, and they also drive the pay. Obviously, compensation is commensurate with the responsibilities that that role has. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. And I don't know that, in my opinion, people put enough focus on the actual job description. And as I mentioned before, for all of you, whether small business owner or thinking about starting your business, as you consider the resources that you're going to need to run your business, I think job descriptions are a very strong guiding factor and can keep everyone honest in the process. So thanks for that. That was really a great question. Okay, we have another question here about how should I communicate pay equity processes internally? I think what's important is that they are communicated. I think that particularly if you're a smaller business, a lot of the HR functions aren't necessarily built out because many small businesses, of course, don't have the resources for an HR function. But I think it's very important to have access to things that are in writing, like the job descriptions, like some of the policies that you have. So regardless of whether you're a large or small business, you keep those things front and center. There's also a lot of companies out there that offer HR services to small businesses on a contract or subscription basis. So I think that's another really good opportunity to think about some of those organizations out there that do this, knowing that many small businesses can't afford to build out this function. Hopefully that's helpful. Thanks for the great question. This is a really good question. Should you take a good enough job in this job climate, AKA a mediocre job with mediocre pay? Wow, this is really a tough one. I think a lot of it really depends on your personal situation. I think that for many people, this has been a terrible struggle. We know, for example, that small businesses employ 50% of the people in the United States. And because we've seen so many problems with small businesses today, we know that's really impacted many jobs held in the consumer sector because they are actually employed by small businesses. I think there's times when necessity has to speak, and depending on your personal situation, I think that there are potentially a lot of jobs opening up out there in new things. So although we've seen a large number of closures, actually 1 in 6 small businesses have closed. We're also seeing a lot of new opportunities. So I think it's really difficult. And I think the other question is to ask the potential employer is why the pay is the way that it's set. I know you mentioned a mediocre job for mediocre pay, but is there a way to take that job when you're talking to them and broaden the responsibilities and perhaps increase the pay, maybe putting forth some of your expertise and how you can continue to add value, maybe over and above how that job description is written? I think those are all things I think we all, as women, have to take a much more proactive approach, sell ourselves, sell our capabilities, and never shortchange all the great knowledge that you have that you've built probably over time. But thank you, that's a great question. I'm going to go to some other questions here that we have. So this is really interesting, in terms of how much should I budget for pay adjustments due to a pay equity problem? It's very difficult to put numbers on this, but I think that if you keep in line with what you know are the correct pay ranges, you always have an idea of where those potential gaps are. Even big companies today, it's reported every day in the news, are really taking a look at what those gaps are. And I think the real question is, bringing people up to parity bringing people up over parity. So I think you have to get a general sense based on a lot of the information that's out there publicly in terms of some of the pay ranges. Then you really calculate out, how much do I want to meet those? Am I capable of meeting those? I think for many companies, unfortunately, equal pay related to gender is a process. Unfortunately, for some organizations, those gaps are pretty big and it takes people a while to fill those. So I think you have to decide based on how your company has that cash capability to increase those, knowing that that's your goal, and then putting yourself really on a timeline so that you have a very strong focus and a strong purpose of where you want to be and when you want to be there. But thank you so much for those questions. Just looking right now in terms of some other questions we have here. I think here's actually a really good one. As an employee, I have seen that there are people making more than I do for the same job. How do I handle that? Well, I think that this is really a tough one. And I think part of the problem is, particularly for females, is we often feel that we don't have the right to bring it up. We don't have the right to ask. And I think that's number one. I believe very strongly in people having a voice and using their voice. And if you feel there's inequities, having that conversation, if it's a larger company with HR, if it's a smaller company, it might be with the owner. But I think really having the right level of conversation, not so much about I'm not getting paid as much as someone else, but really talking about the fact that your capabilities are equal to or more than other people in those particular roles. And you feel that there's a very strong need and a strong opportunity for equal pay based on the role. Again, I go back to job descriptions and making sure that you have a very strong understanding of your job description and how your level of knowledge really helps that job description to come to life and solve the problems in the company versus where you feel that you might be lacking. And I do think that it really behooves companies, both big and small, to utilize their job descriptions to actually create parity in pay rather than driving that apart. So I think that's another really important point. Another question here around, kind of communication. So this is a really interesting question, actually. So I own my own company, and I unfortunately realized that there were some inequities in pay. What do I do? Do I go to those people directly? How do I handle this? So I think it's a really good question. And number one is recognizing that there's a problem. I think that it's critically important to have those conversations with employees because, quite frankly, you may not realize it, but they may already know this. And I think this is something that's very important, is that you want to try to get these things fixed before employees decide to leave. And I think that having a very proactive stance about it, going to them proactively with also the plan on how you hope to kind of lessen that gender gap, which I think is really an important piece, especially today when this is so much in the news. Another question that just came in was about bonuses and how do bonuses, which tend to be more variable, measure in? And it's a really good question. I would say to you that unfortunately there's probably gender gaps in bonuses as well as general pay structures. And I think it's important as you think about bonuses should be based on the quality of the job done, regardless of who does it. Many companies now have ranges of bonuses where if you get, let's say, this level of meet expectations, you get a 30% to target bonus. And I think that having a more specific, something that's aligned to actual facts really creates a situation where your bonus structure can be much more in line with parity, regardless of who the individual is. So I think that's really important, again, to eliminate some of the subjectivity, as much subjectivity as you can, where it's related to gender, and where the subjectivity comes in is really the quality of the performance. And I think this is what I've seen that works really well in companies today. Um, Again, everyone, you can please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We certainly have a lot more time today. Here's actually an interesting discussion. When I'm developing a new role, how do I decide what that pay structure should be? So I think it's a really good question because, again, it goes to, if you have a certain role in your organization and in that role there's X pay, you have to really look at the new role, take a look at the new responsibilities, the additional responsibilities, are there less responsibilities, and really base that off of a pay range that is structurally aligned with what those other roles are and what that other pay is. So I think that's a really important piece, again, is to base it off of fact, and really to base it off of something that's been there that you feel good about, and then use that as a building block for additional roles that you might have. So, one of the things that I get a lot of questions about is this concept of advocating for your people. And I think that's a really important one that I just want to touch on for a minute. But if you're a manager, if you're a leader who's really eager to lessen pay inequality on your team, it's important to be able to advocate for your team members to make that happen. So, for example, if you know that a team member is underpaid, tell them to do some salary research so they can understand how to ask for a suitable compensation bump, doing your next review. I think in that way, you're bringing them into the conversation. And you'll also push them to learn more about their value to the organization based on their experience and results. But I also think that it helps because you're actually starting the conversation and letting them know what they can do and giving them ownership and giving them the power to have a part of control of this. So this whole concept of advocacy is critically important, and it really revolves around a more proactive approach. Another good question on some helpful tips for setting benchmarks for employees. It's interesting. There's some really interesting websites out there. Certainly, Glassdoor comes to mind just as a website, but there are a lot of pay ranges that are out there, especially whether it's through websites, whether it's through some of these compensation sites, but also talking to some fellow companies. If you, for example, are in the health and beauty industry and you really want to understand some benchmarks, you can also ask around. I think there's a number of great groups on LinkedIn in particular industry verticals. And I think really understanding what's out there. Interesting stat, we find that over 60% of small businesses look to other small businesses for help and guidance. So I think that's really important. Certainly if you can't afford or don't want to bring in a compensation consultants, I think there's a lot of opportunity to work within your industry and take a look at what some of the benchmarks are so that you can build your compensation structure around that, depending on where you are. We certainly know that everyone is in a very different spot today in terms of their ability to, to have cash. And another question that I get a lot is really around, COVID has happened. Will there be a lessening of standards in terms of what people expect? Can I hire people at lower pay than I would have in the past? I think the decision on what you have to do internally from a financial perspective is very much dependent on your expense base. And I think those are the things you have to look at. If you do make changes to new roles and perhaps taking a look at your compensation structure, it once again should be done equally. It really should be done based on the job role, based on your ability to pay, versus anything around obviously gender. Because that really, in my experience, that is when you begin to start walking a really not such a great line, because you're really looking at things to make decisions on that are not based on fact, not based on your job descriptions. And I consider fact to be your particular financial or expense situation. So I think it's really important. We know that many small businesses have suffered. I mentioned 1 in 6 businesses have closed. 1 in 4 Black-owned businesses have closed. And then when you get into the female space, we know that many of those that have closed because of the need for females to take over. They have taken over a lot more of the work. So we know that there's a lot of issues and concerns right now around cash flow, around balance sheets, expenses, and all that has to weigh in as you're taking a look at your entire pay structure. And certainly that's going to impact, for many people, bonuses. For many people, it's going to impact raises. But the important piece here is equal pay and equal raises, so that the definition of a raise isn't done based on gender, obviously, but it's really done based on the quality of the work for that particular role. So I think that's really helpful as well. So we're nearing our end of our time. Again, I would just for the last few minutes that we have, if anyone has any other questions, please put them in the chat box. Here's actually another one. I'm feeling more vulnerable now because of COVID, and I'm worried that if I go to my boss and show concern about my pay, that might impact me negatively. Look, it's hard, of course, for me to say your particular situation and your particular employer. What I can tell you is that in conversations I've had, small businesses are very aware of what's happening out there in terms of equal pay. They have experienced it themselves in their past lives. And I think that it's really important for us as women in the workforce that we feel good about having those conversations and being very, very proactive. I think it's important to understand that the quality of the conversation is what really matters. And that from my perspective, we should all feel very free to have the right conversations in a respectful way, so that we feel that we are having and using our voice. And I think that's really important, especially during this time. So I know we have another couple minutes left. I do want to take a minute to, first of all, just thank, Jacqueline Johnson and Create and Cultivate. You guys rock. You are amazing. The topics that you touch on, the concern that you have for the audiences, your willingness to talk about tough things. That is why MasterCard has a partnership with Create and Cultivate. Their wonderful values, their focus on doing well by doing good. And we really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time really helping all of you maybe think a little differently. Again, to all of our business owners out there, I want to tell you how important it is that you know that if you didn't feel important before, you certainly are now. This pandemic has been just so difficult and horrific for so many people. But the one thing I've seen through all of my years covering and working with small businesses, now more than ever, you have a voice. You have a lot of people that are behind you, and not just behind you to help you get through COVID, but a lot of people behind you to get through COVID and beyond. And we know that it's been particularly hard for our female audience, for our female entrepreneurs, for our females that are in the workforce. And know that there are a lot of people focused on this. There's a lot of discussion that's happening about the inequality in pay, about the inequality in the fact that so many women have left the workforce because of the other responsibilities that they have. So again, I want to thank all of you for attending today. It's been really great sharing some time with you. And I look forward to seeing you again soon on the other side, when we know that you will come out great. Thanks so much, and have a really great rest of your day.